Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy podcast. I am your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, Richard Lim's This American President, and more. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more about these wonderful shows. Let me quickly announce we are, of course, on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. There's so many benefits to joining on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. For one, you get to be on the History of the Papacy Diptychs, and you're really a key member of the team of helping this whole organization of the History of the Papacy keep going. So I would definitely appreciate it if you consider joining. Now, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level, Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level, and of course, reaching the ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. In today's episode, Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow takes us through the incredible life of that most famous of Irish saints, Patrick. We'll talk about where he came from, what he wrote about, and some interesting facts about his life. We will also discuss trade, slavery, travel, and other aspects of life in that distant corner of Europe, of Ireland, in an era of a Roman Empire that was falling apart, and it wasn't quite clear what would replace it. Now with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. I have a couple of more questions about that diffusion, but I think we'll have a better picture if we talk about kind of the big player that everybody's probably been waiting for, and that's Patrick, or Saint Patrick, as he's also called. Who was Patrick, and how did he make his impact on how Christianity spread throughout Ireland?
Yeah, so one thing that's really fantastic about Patrick is that we have two works that are his own writings, and this is almost unheard of. We have so little, personal writings from the Atlantic Islands in this period. I mentioned Gildas previously, but he's after Patrick even. So it's amazing that we've got this from Patrick, although it was very purposefully preserved at Armagh, and we'll probably get into that a little bit. So we've got his confession and his letter to Coroticus. Now, the earliest version of the confession survives in the 9th century book of Armagh. It appears to be a document written by Patrick in his old age as he reflects upon his life and his actions, and seems to be a response to some unnamed detractors who appear to level accusations against him for poor behavior. Now, this is not what we really think of when we're thinking of the great Patrick these days.
No, not at all.
So you can see this level of defensiveness that runs through the entire piece. He even tells us specifically, quote, that he long thought to write, but up to now he has hesitated because he feared what people would say, end quote. And if you're interested in reading the full confession for yourself, it's available in translation online at confessio.ie. And the letter to Coroticus is there as well, but I don't think we'll have time to get into the letter today.
Would they have been written in Latin?
Yes. So you can see the original. If you want to try yourself at some Latin, it's there in the original Latin, but they've also got it translated into a few different languages, which is so fantastic.
I'm sure we'll dive into this in later times, but how much would somebody of like Patrick or in that meantime have written in Irish? Would that have been done at all, or was everything pretty well Latinized?
A lot of it is going to be Latin. We get written Irish after exposure to Latin, so I like to think of it as someone's like, this is really great that we can write this down. So let's do that with our own language too. And it's really thanks to the Irish in large part that we have so much about what it was like to learn Latin, because we have all of these Latin primers and study books basically about how to learn Latin that were written by the Irish. And it's really cool, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll probably wind up getting into that a lot more because that's going to affect things later on.
Yeah, I mean, it seems obvious that Patrick probably would have learned Irish. You know, he spent 6 years as a slave, he tells us, and it would be really hard to communicate with anyone if you didn't have any shared language. And then as many years as he's meant to have spent as an adult in Ireland, he must have taken up language ability during that time. But I want to back up a little bit and get to the beginning of Patrick. So he gives us a little bit of information about himself in his confession. He tells us his father's name was Calpurnius and that his father was a deacon. His grandfather's name was Potitus, and he was a priest. He tells us that his family lived near a village called Banavem Tabernii, which was where he was taken from when he was 16. And while this is fantastic information that we frequently yearn for in early sources, the sad news is that we have no idea where Banavem Tabernii was meant to be. And that has engendered lots of discussion on the possible locations that run the gamut from Wales to England and even into southern Scotland. We also don't have anything concrete by which to reckon his year of birth, and there has been much additional discussion on that. And just to round out this early picture of Patrick, he tells us that he wasn't particularly religious as a youth.
I think that's fascinating that, and it's got to be so frustrating when you read a document, and it's probably when they wrote it, everybody knew where Banabim Tyranii is or was. And now, why would they ever write down, oh yeah, well, it's next to this or that. And now it's completely gone.
The same thing happens to us with Gildas. He tells us that he was born a very specific number of years after the Battle of Mount Badon, but we don't know when that was. So thanks, Gildas.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, everybody knew when that battle was. Well, why bother writing it down?
Yeah, 1,500 years later, not so much.
Yeah, exactly. So then getting into, now we know a little bit about Patrick's background. What was that next phase of his life?
Yeah, so I think it's worth mentioning that just kind of congealing Patrick together, that he probably lived in the 5th century AD. He was the son of a Romanized Briton and nominally a 3rd generation Christian. He was also sufficiently educated as to be able to write in Latin, which, as we've already mentioned, is the language that his 2 texts are in. So he worked as a shepherd in Ireland for 6 years as a slave once he was captured. And he only tells us that it was in a wooded area near the Western Sea. And for that reason, its location also remains elusive. So he tells us that it was during this period that he became religious and that he was inspired by God. And he seems to believe that God spoke directly to him to direct him out of slavery and back into freedom. He says that he heard a voice talking about a ship that was going to take him to freedom. But that ship was 200 miles away from where he worked as a slave. Now, I'm cutting this story very, very short, that he was able to board the ship and they sailed for 3 days before coming to land. And we've already talked about how quickly we might expect them to be able to get to that land. And I think the next bit is interesting. So we weren't told about any inclement weather. So maybe they were just really terrible sailors. I'm not sure. After landing, they then spent 28 days, quote, wandering in the wilderness. And that, to me, seems to be a biblical reference there. We know Patrick has lots of biblical references in his writing. And if you go to the website, they've got a lot of that marked out. But it took a few years for Patrick to get back to his family. And by this point, they perhaps understandingly didn't really want him to leave again. was not too long after he got back home, however, that he had the famous vision that called him back to work in Ireland. And if you don't mind, I do think it's worth reciting this vision in full.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So he says, I saw in a vision in the night a man whose name was Victoricus, coming, as it were, from Ireland, with so many letters that they could not be counted. He gave me one of these, and I read the beginning of the letter. It was the voice of the Irish people. While I was reading out the beginning of the letter, I thought I heard at that moment the voice of those who were beside the wood of Vaucluse near the Western Sea. They called out, as it were, with one voice, we beg you, holy boy, to come and walk again among us. This touched my heart deeply, and I could not read any further. I woke up then. So that's his famous vision that called him back to the Irish people, even after he'd obtained his freedom.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be a lot of guts to go through that harrowing of an adventure, and then you're going to pack up and go back to Ireland, because presumably he doesn't even know what he's walking into.
Right. Yeah, I think there's lots of questions, and we'll see this same idea of God talking directly to Patrick kind of coming through his confession. But he tells us that after he became a bishop, some of his superiors put him to the test by, you quote, putting his sins against his hard work as a bishop. And he tells us that this is something that had happened 30 years previously, which he had already confessed to when he was a deacon. And the incident in question seems to have occurred when he was about 15 years old. So this is even pre-abduction time, when Patrick told us he wasn't particularly religious. And he says that his defense was that he stayed on in Ireland, which was not of his own choosing, until he almost perished. And this really feels like one of the times that he's trying to illustrate to us how much he has sacrificed for what he sees as his God-given sacred task. And he then goes on to basically swear with God as his witness that nothing he writes in his account has been a lie. And it appears to be after the hearing associated with this incident that he was made bishop. So he had done all of the confessing of it, and he became bishop, and they brought it back up again. But he then later writes about how he would like to go visit his family in Britain, or to travel to Gaul to see his brothers in religion and saints there, but that he stays in Ireland because God told him to. So I don't know, I just really find this repetitive, hey, I'm here kind of against my own will, amusing, interesting. I think it's definitely something interesting to think about.
Yeah, because what's his motivation? Is it purely that he's staying there purely out of responsibility, and his feeling that that calling is more than what he wants to, his calling to be in Ireland is more important than his personal will that he wants to go take a vacation to Gaul or to go and see his family again?
Right. And he's even saying it's more important than the opinions of his superiors who tell him not to go. So this is a very sacred, God-given task.
And now a word from our sponsors. It's interesting, too, that he would have superiors at that point as well. That, you know, if he's the one who's converted Ireland, you would think that he would naturally be the one to rise to the top, but that he does have a hierarchy above him.
Well, at this point, he hasn't gone back to Ireland yet. So This is him kind of coming up through the ranks in the church.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Oh, yeah. Okay. I see that now.
So it's at this point then in the Confessio that we get him kind of back in Ireland, and it speaks a little more directly to his experience as a wandering baptizer in Ireland. He specifically says that there were many who forbade this mission, but there's another passage that I'd like to read that gives us some additional insight into his confession. So he says, "Those who wish may laugh and insult, but I will not be silent, nor will I hide the signs and wonders which the Lord has shown me even many years before they came about. He knows all things even before the beginning of time." So I think in this, you can really see that defensive tone in his writing, but you can also see this strong pride that he has and this claim to be in direct communication with God, which I've mentioned kind of runs throughout this confession. And we do see in the confession a lot of this kind of long suffering of Patrick. So he tells us that once he was back in Ireland, he bore insults from unbelievers and heard words of hatred spoken about him. He claims that all of the people he interacted with had no prior knowledge of God and were people who served idols and unclean things. So the question that comes up for me here is, what about Palladius? Where are these Christians that Palladius was sent to? And if Prosper is correct, even converted some of them. So we might ask, did Patrick purposefully avoid areas that had Christians? He didn't write about anyone coming before him from the church. And we might think about, if you've got a map of Ireland, County Kildare and County Meath are kind of central to the island. Is it possible that Patrick was, north of there? He talks about being west, but we don't necessarily know how north he was. Is it just happenstance that he happened to go in places that Palladius hadn't gone to? Kind of what's going on here?
Yeah, it's interesting because Palladius was, these numbers are a little, there's a little flexibility in them, but Palladius would have been maybe a few decades before Patrick.
Yeah, we're not exactly sure. There are some later biographers that put Patrick in Ireland literally the year after Palladius, but that seems to be them just trying to increase the reputation of Patrick. You even see some mentions that Patrick and Palladius were the same person, but again, that's later biographers. So we can't really be sure. There's so many questions there.
There could have been a level of competition between the two that doesn't get written down. Even if Palladius was a little bit before, Patrick could potentially wanted to outdo him.
Yeah, there's so many possibilities that are out there. And, who knows, maybe one day we'll uncover the lost confession of Palladius. I can dream, right?
Yeah, it's just waiting there to be discovered.
But talking about the people that Patrick seemed to be converting, I mentioned the youth of the noble classes. So he talks about women coming to him and saying that they want to be a bride of Christ instead of just getting married, and that the sons desire to become monks. Patrick goes on to tell us that their fathers weren't very happy about this fact, and that really makes sense to me. So we've talked about how society works a bit, and young people were really important in the forging and confirmation of marriage alliances and bonds of kinship. And if you don't have any young people to marry off, then your ability to network and protect yourself and your people is diminished. So I just have this image of rebellious teenagers in early medieval Ireland deciding to go off and become monks or nuns as a way to anger their parents.
It's kind of using the common term today. They're sort of influencers of the day, too. If the right person or two thinks, oh, I'm going to adopt this cool new thing that's going around, that can kind of spread amongst the young people as well.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. There seems to be this rebelliousness that might be associated with it. And, even beyond these, high status youths, Patrick also talks specifically about converting slaves, which can even further hinder social hierarchy and the local economy. If your slaves are wandering off on you, or even if they're just becoming Christian, if you're already Christian and now your slaves are becoming Christian, then there's going to be a lot of pressure on you to not hold other Christians in slavery.
Yeah, it brings up all sorts of moral questions and moral dilemmas for a slave owner. when they're, and I think that sort of situation, as you can see that happening all around the Roman world where slavery is so common.
Yeah, there's a really great book that I read called Slavery After Rome. And I can't remember the author's name, but I can get it to you to include in the show notes. But it's really a fantastic read about, how slavery persists or how it morphs into other parts of societal hierarchy and how it can be used or abused depending on the situation by different parts of society and going into kind of the high Middle Ages. And I think that's something that is really interesting in how that changes in the post-Roman period. But I think this is a great moment to maybe just have a quick talk about slavery in Ireland.
Because I think we were talking about this earlier, we often get a mindset of a very specific form of slavery that was used in the North, South America, the Caribbean, in the transatlantic slave trade, which that doesn't necessarily that doesn't prepare us completely for the type of slavery that we would have seen in the context of the 400s, 500s in Ireland.
Right. And I think that's something that's really important to bring up. And, we had slavery in Rome, and that was, again, very different from the chattel slavery that we see in the transatlantic slave trade. There was slavery in Ireland, and there were multiple ways to become a slave. You could be entered as a slave if you are unable to pay restitution for damages that you've committed against someone, or if your family is unwilling to pay those damages, they might put you into slavery as a result. You may be captured by a rival group and put into slavery that way. And I think it's also important to recognize that this slavery existed in Ireland even before the Vikings came, because there's a lot of talk about Viking slave trade. And we know that Dublin became a very important slave market, but we don't want to lay all of that at their own feet because there was slavery in Ireland beforehand. But the biggest difference is in that word that I used, chattel. So slaves in Rome and slaves in Ireland were still considered, to a degree, people. They were still humans and considered that way in tandem with their unfree status. Whereas chattel slavery, as we understand it in North and South America through the transatlantic slave trade, utterly dehumanized the enslaved people and made them objects. So they were no longer considered human really in any way. And I think that's the most important thing that we should recognize as a difference between these kinds of slavery.
Would there have been any concept like in chattel slavery where the person and all of their children and their children's children, a generational slavery, was there any concept of that? Or was a person necessarily their children? Were they going to be slaves?
I think, and I'm not an expert on the slavery itself, but I know that a lot of that's going to be affected by who the other parent is. So if you've got a free parent and an unfree parent, there will be questions about the status of the child. I believe that there were situations that unfree status was heritable. So a child would take on the status of its parent, or in usual case, its mother. But the consideration of the humanness of those people is the critical piece to talk about here.
Yeah, I think it's really, it's fair to say that slavery is obviously terrible, but it's a complicated institution.
Yeah. So
because it's a legal institution. So it's, the laws of a particular context in a particular place. There's so many complexities built into that.
Right. And we can recognize today, and I would say that many people even recognized back then, that slavery as it existed in Ireland was bad. Slavery as it existed, throughout the Viking world was bad. and yet still recognize that there's a important difference in the conceptions of those kinds of slavery versus transatlantic chattel slavery. All slavery is bad, and I think that's something that we can all agree on, but I don't think they should necessarily be equated to transatlantic chattel slavery just because of how extra egregious that was.
Yeah, I also think it's that element of the religious aspect put on where the people are, especially in that early age where people are becoming Christian, their slaves are becoming Christian, and the push and the pull between, I really shouldn't be doing this because I'm enslaving my co-religionist, but these are my slaves that I'm using for my own economic benefits. And that's how that plays out, is really complicated. And I think it must have been very difficult for them to rectify that as a society. Probably for some people, it wasn't difficult to rectify. They just did it. But I would think a lot of people who are actually thinking about these sort of things, that was a very difficult circle to square or square to circle. However, I always get that mixed up. But that's a difficult moral dilemma that people are in.
Yeah, and it's definitely causing changes in the society and the economy. And I think there's a lot of discussion that's out there about it. And as I said, I'm not a specialist in it, but I do think it's important to recognize these things and to discuss them and how that affects our understanding of medieval history as, modern people looking back to it.
And somebody like Patrick, who was a slave and then becomes free, how does the way that he would, and that's probably not completely a unique story. A lot of people would have floated in between. That's another thing, that people would float in between slavery and freedom, and you could move in and out of those, which was something that was not the case in transatlantic chattel slavery.
Right. Yeah. And that's a really interesting part of Patrick's story. And I don't think that we really get as much of his thoughts and feelings on the matter as we'd like to, because that would be something that we'd really like to see, is how did he feel about this and how did this affect him personally, that unfortunately is just lost to us.
We could really talk about this, but that's a whole subject in and of itself. But moving into more of Patrick's later career, what could we say about him as he is going around and he's working in these different aspects and social classes in society?
Yeah, so we get some information from Patrick about his experiences going around and interacting with all these different kings. And he tells us that, a lot of these women that he worked with who he baptized would bring him gifts. But again, because this piece is in response to his detractors, he tells us he would always refuse them. If they put trinkets on the altar, he would return them. And he says that this would make them upset, but he must do so in case unbelievers would trap him or his ministry of service for any reason. And indeed, he tells us that at least once he was arrested and all of his goods were seized, and he had to kind of, go through the legal system to get out of it, and that he paid even more, 15 times the value that he should have had to pay in order to finish the legal case. And he even tells us one line that I absolutely love. He says, "I spend myself for you so that you may have me for yours." And I've just got this, picture in my mind of Patrick as the god Maui in Moana singing the "You're Welcome" song. Everybody's like, "But we didn't really ask you to be here." And he's like, "You're welcome."
Yeah, I'm doing you a favor by being here and spending all this stuff.
Yeah, so it really seems unlikely to me that many of the Irish, at least initially, really felt that Patrick needed to be there. He tells us that when he baptized so many thousands of people that he didn't ask for any pay. And if he received pay, to tell him and he'll give the money back to you. He ordained clerics for free. And one interesting bit is that he paid the sons of nobles to escort him throughout the countryside, and he gave gifts to kings. And I think this gives us a little bit of information about what it was like kind of out there in early medieval Ireland. He needed to have an escort, partially because that's going to help to cement his status. If he's going from one king to another, he's not really from Ireland, so he doesn't necessarily have a inherent status, and he doesn't have an inherent honor price. And so he's got to make relationships with these kings and build his retinue in order to give himself a value to participate in their legal system. So that gives us a little bit more information. But thinking about why people may have chosen to convert, it makes sense to me that women might be attracted to Christianity, as joining a religious movement might enable them to avoid undesirable marriages arranged by their families. And this is indeed a really frequent story that's told in the hagiographies, or the lives of women saints. So Patrick claims to have baptized many thousands of men and women, and to have prayed up to 100 times in a day, and maybe as much in a night. And this part that he tells us really reminds me of the stories that our grandparents always seem to tell us about having to go uphill both ways to get to school as children. But I think there's another final piece that I'd like to quote that gives us some more insight into Patrick. And he says, "If I have ever imitated anything good for the sake of my God whom I love, I ask that he grant me to be able to shed my blood with these converts and captives, even were I to lack a grave for burial, or my dead body were to be miserably torn apart limb from limb by dogs or wild beasts, or were the birds of heaven to devour it." Now it goes on a bit from there, but I think we've got the idea of just how deeply he feels about this work that he feels called to. But I also get a little bit of a sense of martyrdom aspirations that might be playing on in his head. And I say that, and I quickly want to note that martyrdom isn't really a big thing in Ireland before the Norse arrive, but he's really like putting his whole self in there.
Yeah, especially I'm sure he would have read accounts of bishops in other places, and martyrdom's a nice way to end your career.
I mean, it definitely would leave an impact on everybody else.
Before we get into some of the myths and the tall tales of Patrick, I mean, it's virtually impossible to say numbers wise, but in this time period in the 400s going into the 500s, how Christianized would Ireland have been?
Not very is the short answer. So Patrick makes some really bold claims regarding his success, and later biographers and hagiographers tend to take it even further. But the historic record shows us that Ireland wasn't predominantly Christian until centuries later, with evidence for non-Christian belief even into the 7th and 8th centuries. Patrick's cult, as I mentioned, gets picked up by Armagh around the mid-7th century, and they begin to build a claim for primacy of all Ireland upon their claims to Patrick and his cult. And in their bid to play up Patrick's reputation, they even left out bits of his texts in their version of it in the Book of Armagh. And the bits that they left out were those that showed him in a less positive light than the ultra hero that they were building an image of and who we kind of think of today. And I think that reading Patrick's confession and understanding the nature of society in Ireland gives a good picture of just how difficult the process of conversion must have been. There was no single ruler that you could convert who would then demand that his thousands of followers immediately follow suit. There was no democratic style vote of the entire island to decide to become Christian, as occurred in Iceland around 1000 AD. So anyone attempting to convert others had to work at it in little pieces, and through their engaging with a king in one place would likely be inserting themselves into a complex social and political landscape that would affect their attempts to convert that king's neighbors. Because remember, as I said, all of these alliances and relationships are quite fluid. And I think this is really well evidenced in what's called the First Synod of St. Patrick, which actually has nothing to do with St. Patrick. It was dated branding. Sometime, it was dated sometime between the 6th and 9th centuries. So yeah, the name of Patrick becomes this kind of catch-all. Like, you just want to slap his name on everything and be like, oh, this is related to Patrick, so it's, twice as better. So the First Synod of St. Patrick discusses appropriate and inappropriate behavior for Christians in regard to pagans. So we're told that clerics should not give surety for a pagan. So in court, or even in general, they shouldn't be giving sureties. Churches are not to accept alms from pagans, which, if you remember how churches work, they're constantly looking for alms. This is a whole segment of society that they're cutting off. They don't even want their charity. Christians who swear an oath before a pagan must do a year's penance. And this, I think, is especially interesting because that penance is equal to committing murder or adultery. So that's the kind of level that we're looking at for that penance. And that failure to pay debts is referred to as, quote, acting like a pagan.
And now a word from our sponsors. Oh, wow. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think that one thing that really strikes me, and strikes me as unique about Ireland, is that particular time frame when they are being introduced to Christianity. It's so much different than, say, even when the Anglo-Saxons just a couple of years earlier, or the Germanic groups a couple of years before then, they really had a big incentive to adopt Christianity because that was a cultural way for them to plug into Roman trade and Roman culture, the things that they really wanted to. But this narrow band of history and the geography of Ireland, they don't have a huge incentive to plug into these other cultures for trade and for the benefits that come along with Christianity. There just wasn't that same incentive structure to adopt Christianity as there was for other groups that would adopt Christianity.
I think that's still there to some degree. It may not seem quite so obvious because Ireland is on an island of its own. But if we remember back to looking at the water as a means of connection rather than a means of separation, they still have some of these trades. Although the Roman Empire is kind of folding back in on itself to protect the homeland at this point. So we do have that, and getting on into the later centuries, we just don't really have Rome to the degree that we did previously. So that is going to have an effect.
Yeah, that's say in Gaul, the trade, the huge incentives that there would have been for, say, a Goth to become Christian in the 200s or the 300s to really plug into this rich, wealthy trade network. It's just not quite there in the 500s.
Yeah, it's definitely different at that point. I think one thing that's interesting to bring up is that these ecclesiastical roles were the kind of up-and-coming intellectual positions in Ireland. And it's likely that a number of Druids, which were the kind of homegrown intellectual elite of Ireland, and it would have been of Wales and Scotland, And so it's likely that a number of these druids made the choice to jump into Christianity because they saw a benefit to themselves or to their work into moving into this new intellectual role. And hopefully next time or another time we can talk about how this likely affected the development of intellectual pursuits in Christian Ireland, and likely a lot of the very robust Christian literature that comes out of Ireland.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about that, because I can see some parallels in other places where there was a incentive for the intellectual class to convert to Christianity. And that's a big, they're a big group that has a lot of influence on, especially in the Druids case, that it seems like once they start getting in on the action, that could be a way for things to spread. That's what has been making me think so much about Ireland, is that it's such a different, the culture and the time period, and so many different factors make it that Christianity that almost breaks a lot of the rules that we saw happen so many other places on how Christianity spread.
Yeah, and getting into all the intellectualism that occurs in Christianity in early medieval Ireland is stuff that just fascinates me. And I know that we'll get into some of that because of how fascinated I am by it, but I think definitely not today.
Yeah. This is before we move on, maybe what's one or two of the famous maybe things that weren't so historical but more tall tales of Patrick that you enjoy more?
My favorite one, and the one that I always talk about with my students, is the idea that Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland. So first off, I should say there were never any snakes in Ireland, not since the glaciers receded. So no snakes. The use of this idea is a trope in hagiography, and hagiography is kind of the writing of a saint's life. It's what we think of as the formal literary category. And so we'll see other saints who drive all the mice out of this place, or Saint Columba makes it so that no snakes can hurt any of the people on the island of Iona. So it's something that happens fairly frequently. Like, this is not a one-off. And this also doesn't come into the life of St. Patrick until the 13th century. So it's really late that someone decides, oh, we'll just write this in for Patrick. So we've got all of this lack of snakes, late entry into the hagiography. And then there's also this really, really modern idea that the snakes are a metaphor for pagans. And that is just absolutely incorrect. If you read any of the later lives of Patrick, they make no qualms whatsoever about mentioning pagans outright or being very forthright. There was no need to include a metaphor for them. They were very in your face about it when they wanted to be. So those are kind of the really big things about Patrick that I'm like, no.
Are there snakes in England, Scotland, Wales?
I know of one snake in Scotland called the adder, and it's mildly venomous is what I understand. Like, it'll make you not feel good, but it's not going to kill you.
Yeah, I think that's such a strange one that why it's so random. But like you said, if it has a metaphorical aspect, that would make it definitely a better story.
Well, really, it just seems to become something that they kind of tack into a bunch of saints' lives. Oh, and here's a thing that this saint did as well. We'll just slip that in. That sounds good.
I think a good way to wrap up today, because we have covered a lot of ground and there's still a lot of ground to cover. What are some topics that you think might be of interest later on, or things that you could foresee coming up that are really important for this story?
Things that I'm really excited to talk about are, I think, the development of monasticism in Ireland, and also this church in Scotland at kind of North Britain, and how that has been developing with the discovery of Port Mahomet, which was a Pictish monastery up there. I'm really interested in talking about the various intellectual pursuits of the ecclesiastical class in Ireland, and computus, or the computation of Easter, and the Easter controversy are some things I'm really interested in.
Well, that we can look forward to that and much more. If you're interested in learning more about some of these subjects, Dr. McNamara has graciously included some resources that you can look to, which I will link to in the show notes. So I just want to thank you so much, Dr. McNamara, for leading us through this conversation today, and I look forward to more.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have been here today, and I look forward to future discussions.